This video introduces the Nourishment Table, which, in a society plagued by malnutrition, aims to provide a more flexible and robust approach to dietary guidance. The concept is based on a study by a group of scientists combining expertise in nutrition, evidence-based medicine, cultural food studies, and food technology. It was presented in the context of the 2024 Summit on the Societal Role of Meat and Livestock and tried to answer two questions. What are the most pressing topics in today's nutrition and health debate? And how can we better integrate them into dietary advice? Before answering those questions, let's take a closer look at some of the limitations of current dietary recommendations. A first remark is that these aren't based on scientific insights alone. They're also shaped by culture and history. When dietary advice was first formalized in the late 19th century, it was heavily influenced by the ideals of the progressive era. Food reformists believed that people were unable to manage their own health, so they advocated for government interventions to promote more rational diets. The consumption of whole grains and other bland foods was encouraged, but red meat, sugar, and processed foods were viewed as luxuries. Rationing during World War I also played its role, as Americans were asked to adopt meatless days and to embrace whole grains and other unpopular foods. These dietary views were spread through the discipline of home economics and the first dietetic associations. In practice, dietary advice became a tool for reinforcing social norms and for imposing middle-class values. All this was done under the guise of what appeared to be the neutral language of science. During the Second World War, however, priorities shifted, and the conversation surrounding nutrition evolved. While rationing remained significant during the war period, there was a renewed emphasis on ensuring adequate nutrition, with advice highlighting the importance of consuming nourishing food groups. Among these, meat was prominently featured. After the war, during the golden 50s and the 60s, such advice remained dominant. But then, in the 1970s, a new priority emerged within policy circles, one which was driven by the financial crisis and neo-Malthusian concerns about population growth, resource depletion, and environmentalism. A 1969 Rockefeller report titled Populations and the American Future emphasized that rising prices would necessitate a shift from traditional agriculture toward food from factories, with a specific reference to synthetic meat and the need for a lobby for the future. Meanwhile, the Club of Rome revived the progressive era's earlier calls for top-down scientific management. Following the 1973 oil crisis, the first food pyramid was created by a Swedish household economist. Its design emphasized the role of cheap staples, like bread, potatoes, and dairy, followed by fruits and vegetables as supplemental foods for nutritional value, and the more expensive apex foods, which included meat, fish, and eggs. While this pyramid was initially designed with an economic rationale, it eventually evolved into a nutritionally motivated model aimed at promoting better health and fighting chronic disease, in line with the dietary guidelines for Americans, which were established in 1980. This was also when the vilification of cholesterol and fat became a core element of dietary advice. In a next step, the food pyramid morphed into food plates, where grains remained prominent and protein became an abstract term representing both animal and plant-based protein sources. By 2015, environmental sustainability also started to influence dietary recommendations, encouraging a shift from animal-based to more plant-based diets. The pyramid didn't entirely disappear. For example, it still persists in the dietary model proposed by the Italian pasta and biscuit giant Barilla, which conveniently promotes the consumption of cereals for both human and environmental health. This brings us to an important side note: industry lobbying. Over the years, opposing interests have relentlessly tried to either downplay or promote the role of specific food groups. And that struggle continues today, with various conflicts of interest surfacing in nutrition committees. The food pyramid is also still used in the official dietary recommendations in Belgium, which for some reason has been designed in an inverted position. In this model, red meat is placed at the very bottom of the pyramid, below butter, while all processed meats are excluded from the pyramid entirely. In 2018, these trends culminated in the planetary health diet proposed by the Eat Lancet Commission, a food plate which leaves very little space for animal source foods. The Commission also specifically labeled red meat as an unhealthy option. A next point to address is that dietary recommendations can often be simplistic. They tend to overlook the fact that metabolic responses to food vary significantly from person to person. Since each body is unique, the notion of a universally optimal diet is illusory. Worse, imposing such diets may undermine the body's nutritional wisdom by interfering with its ability to self-select foods and regulate nutrient intake based on physiological feedback. This ability has been extensively documented in animals, and there is no compelling reason to believe humans would differ, except, of course, when the consumption of modern foods overrides natural feedback signals of hunger and satiety. A classic 1939 study by Clara Davis has shown that when presented a variety of wholesome foods, young children were able to spontaneously self-select a nutritionally adequate diet and thrive, and do so in many different ways. Yet the study also noted that the meals deviated from what was normally recommended, stating that some choices would have been, quote-unquote, a dietitian's nightmare. Dr. Davis concluded that this isn't all that different from what is valid for ancestral-type populations in many parts of the world, who enjoyed excellent nutrition based on a variety of nourishing foods. And this, of course, despite the fact that they had never been confronted with American-style dietary recommendations or advice from dietitians. They do base themselves, however, partially on traditional knowledge, and mostly on what their bodies tell them to eat. There are indeed multiple ways to adopt a nourishing diet, many of which conflict with what are now considered standard dietary guidelines. This is the case, for example, with low-carb diets, certain indigenous diets, or the very diets on which Homo sapiens evolved. Even within Southern Europe, there are healthy alternatives to the now generalized version of Mediterranean-style dieting. One such example is the Southern European Atlantic diet, found in Spain and Portugal, which is characterized by the regular consumption of red meat and processed pork. So why is there such a disproportionate insistence on rigid and Western-centric dietary solutions? This brings us to a third major problem with a lot of the current recommendations. By narrowing down the full human omnivore spectrum to what is deemed a healthy eating pattern, public health nutrition risks becoming paternalistic and even neocolonial. It often displays all three signs of arrogance. First, by being aggressively assertive, even pursuing symptomless individuals in the general citizenry. Second, by being presumptuous, confident that it does more good than harm. And third, by being overbearing, attacking those who question the value of its recommendations. A shocking example is the Nunavik Food Guide, designed to steer indigenous communities in northern Canada toward healthier eating habits. After witnessing their health deteriorate from adopting Western-style diets, the government decided to confront them with the science behind the food pyramid. In a misguided, if not outright racist attempt to make it appear culturally relevant, the guide was shaped like an igloo. The recommendations as such, however, are entirely inappropriate. By promoting fruits and vegetables, including watermelons and bananas, as well as cereals, foods that do not even grow in this agriculturally unsuitable region, along with dairy, which has no place in their traditional diet, the model marginalizes the true ancestral foods. Meat and fish are relegated to the top of the igloo, and to make it even more painful and out of touch, an option of alternatives was added to the meat and fish category. Of all dietary models, the Eat Lancet diet is arguably the most neo-colonial. By seeking to impose a planetary health diet on the world, it disregards the cultural richness and immense diversity of regional diets. While the Eat Lancet Commission does claim to respect cultural differences, this is little more than empty rhetoric. In practice, its food group windows are so restrictive that only vegan to semi-vegetarian diets fit the bill. The initiative has drawn criticism from a group of anthropologists who faulted the Commission for its excessive reliance on the almost meaningless concept of healthy diets and for framing health as an issue of personal responsibility. This approach, quote-unquote, overlooks the sociocultural practices of the people who will be eating these healthy diets and the complexities of nourishment that are central to kinship, social life, and caregiving. But it's worse than that. The Eat Lancet dietary model isn't even scientifically sound. Professor Ioannidis, a renowned expert in evidence-based medicine and nutrition, has outright dismissed it as science fiction. This brings us to the next issue, the problem of low-certainty evidence. In a 2008 paper critical of what are now seen as fatally flawed and counterproductive recommendations on dietary fat, a group of scientists advocated for higher standards of evidence in policymaking. They even suggested that, quote-unquote, when adequate evidence is not available, the best option may be to issue no guideline. The issue, however, is that most evidence in nutritional science is of low certainty, with only a few cases reaching moderate certainty. According to the principles of evidence-based medicine, when evidence is so poor, recommendations should be conditional and pluralistic. Importantly, they should be based on personal values and preferences and carefully negotiated between individuals and health practitioners. Based on all this, and considering that malnutrition in society is only worsening, isn't it time we ask ourselves, are we not facing a failed policy? And how much longer should public health nutritionists continue doubling down on the same unproductive dietary advice? Can't we do better? Or put another way, can't we develop a dietary model that is more aligned with today's priorities, one that is simple but not simplistic, more flexible and respectful of personal and cultural diversity, more evidence-based, and ultimately more successful? In developing such a model aimed at proper nourishment, two key elements are fundamental to the discussion: the level of food processing and the nutrient density of the diet. Let's bring it on. Here's the nourishment table. At the top of the table, we find the much-debated issue of ultra-processed foods. What should be done about them? While ultra-processed foods don't necessarily need to be completely avoided, the Nourishment Table advises against diets that are predominantly composed of such foods. This recommendation is based on a combination of factors. First, observational studies suggest a consistent association between diets high in ultra-processed foods and poorer health outcomes. An umbrella review has argued there is now convincing evidence linking these diets to obesity, cardiometabolic diseases, mental disorders, and increased mortality. As said before, however, much of this observational evidence remains of low certainty and is not sufficient to prove a causal relationship. Yet, there are also intervention trials that demonstrate a direct and causal link between diets dominated by ultra-processed foods and overeating, leading participants to accumulate body weight. In a randomized controlled trial conducted by Kevin Hall, the ultra-processed diets were matched to minimally processed control diets regarding calories, macronutrients, sugar, fat, sodium, and fiber. This finding suggests that the harm caused by ultra-processed diets extends beyond the conventional concerns of problematic nutrient combinations involving high fat, sugar, and salt. A similar trial was conducted by Japanese researchers, yielding similar outcomes. The researchers speculated that the overeating effect may be related to a reduced chewing frequency, which can result from the softer and hyperpalatable nature of many ultra-processed foods. However, there are many more mechanisms of concern. The biochemical makeup of ultra-processed foods appears to amplify reward signals, particularly when they are simultaneously high in fat and refined carbohydrates. Their food matrices are usually degraded, and they typically offer low nutritional value. Because they are often lacking in protein and micronutrients, they may drive overconsumption. They also can generate glycemic and inflammatory responses, referred to as fast food fever, as well as adverse effects on gut microbiota, for instance, because of the presence of texturizers and other chemical additives in the gut. Then there is the notion of plain common sense. We know that diseases associated with modernity tend to affect societies that consume modern foods, while such diseases are rare in ancestral populations where ultra-processed foods are unknown. We also know that when these ancestral populations adopt Western diets, they rapidly begin to develop chronic diseases. What then with other processing levels, or those foods that are labeled as unprocessed, minimally processed, or just processed? And how does that relate to nutrient density and nourishing capacity? Within these categories of foods, the most important aspect to consider is ensuring that the diet does not have too low a nutrient density, as this poses a risk for deficiencies. Diets with low nutrient densities are commonly found in low-income countries, typically due to a limited share of animal source foods. This is no coincidence, as animals occupy a higher trophic level. Low nutrient densities can therefore also pose a risk for individuals who primarily follow plant-based diets, and particularly so in the absence of micronutrient fortification and supplementation. The semi-vegetarian Eat Lancet diet, for instance, has been shown to be deficient in several important micronutrients, such as iron, zinc, and calcium. Its recommended share of animal source foods is set at 14% of caloric intake, and it has been calculated that doubling this share is necessary to achieve adequate nutrient coverage. A similar threshold of approximately 30% for animal source foods in the diet is evident when examining national diets worldwide. When diets fall below this threshold, various micronutrient deficiencies tend to increase. The Eat Lancet diet, with its recommended 14%, clearly resides in a zone of risk. It may not be a coincidence that this threshold aligns closely with the proportions found in ancestral diets of hunter-gatherer populations, suggesting evolutionary appropriateness. Such diets typically derive a mean of 68% of their calories from animal source foods, with about half of the calories coming from animal sources in warmer climate zones, while some communities, like the Inuit, consume almost exclusively animal foods. Others primarily eat plants. However, all of them generally include a minimum of 20 to 30% animal foods. The Eat Lancet diet thus appears to be irrelevant to what was evolutionarily viable. From a somewhat different perspective, the amount of meat proposed by the Eat Lancet Commission mirrors consumption levels in low-income countries such as Sudan, India, and Bangladesh, places where malnutrition is widespread and stunting rates among young children are horrendous. Given the serious implications for nutrient security, advocating for such low levels of meat consumption globally poses an unacceptable risk. Returning to the discussion on processing, it's important to emphasize that the Nourishment Table is not anti-processing. On the contrary, it highlights that moderately processed foods are a vital part of most human diets, enhancing both flexibility and nutrient density. Modern food processing has greatly expanded dietary options, such as making vegetarian diets more feasible than they were ancestrally. In heavily plant-based diets, proper processing is crucial for improving digestibility, reducing plant toxins and anti-nutritional factors, and increasing nutrient levels through methods like fortification. Raw vegan diets, however, should be avoided, as should vegan diets that rely on mock foods, which are ultra-processed rather than moderately processed. The challenge here is that while most vegan dieters can meet protein requirements, they are less likely to do so when limiting ultra-processed foods. Avoiding animal source foods, therefore, becomes a delicate balancing act, one that should be approached with diligence and care. So, what steps can we take to ensure we consume meals with sufficient nutrient density? The Nourishment Table avoids prescribing specific foods, but advises prioritizing protein-rich and micronutrient-dense foods of all kinds. The key condition is that these foods should be minimally or moderately processed, with an additional recommendation to minimize sugar, refined starches, and frying oils. In practice, there is a wide variety of such nutrient-rich options available, including fish, seafood, dark leafy greens, organ meats, red meat, eggs, and dairy. Prioritizing these foods according to your preferences provides a strong nutritional foundation, allowing you to complement them with less nutrient-dense options for flavor and enjoyment. Focusing on such satiating cornerstone foods provides ample protein, vitamins, and minerals. Data from the Global Pure cohort, spanning 80 countries, confirms that diets centered on fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes, whole-fat dairy, red meat, and fish, while emphasizing healthy fats and minimizing carbohydrate staples, not only improve nutrient intake but also correspond with reduced cardiovascular and mortality risks, leading to better overall health. There's of course a reason humans do better on nutrient-rich foods. Transitioning from nutrient-poor to nutrient-rich diets with plenty of animal-based foods was key to our evolutionary success, and it set us apart from other primates. This dietary shift allowed us to reduce the size of our digestive system while freeing energy to fuel the growth of our larger brains. However, in doing so, we lost a lot of fermentative capacity and became more dependent on obtaining nutrients directly from our food, as they were once abundant in our diet. This made us less efficient at converting plant-based nutrient precursors. This became strikingly clear during one of the biggest dietary experiments in human history, the transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. Nutrient-dense foods were replaced by cereal staples, leading to impoverished diets. The archaeological record shows clearly that this shift brought an increase in malnutrition, dental decay, and a decline in bone health. Agriculture did not initially lead to a better fed population, but only to more people. It was only later, with the introduction of eggs, dairy, and some meat products, that health markers began to improve somewhat. The very upper tier of nutrient density on the Nourishment Table warrants some attention. This area can in principle only be reached with a very high intake of animal-based foods, especially when processing is kept minimal. A concern may be that elevated consumption of animal foods has in some cases been associated with increased risks of chronic diseases. Should we worry? It depends. The evidence linking animal source foods to chronic diseases is increasingly being questioned. While eggs and poultry generally have mostly neutral impacts, it seems that consuming generous portions of whole fat dairy and seafood may even be associated with protective outcomes. The situation regarding high intake levels of unprocessed red meat is more controversial. However, recent systematic reviews suggest that the potential absolute risks associated with its consumption are small and uncertain. Importantly, this relationship may not even be causal. When larger quantities of red meat are included as part of a healthy background diet, associated risks appear to diminish significantly or even disappear. The key may not be unprocessed red meat itself, but rather how it is prepared and consumed in meals. Strikingly, the PURE study indicates that higher intake levels of red meat do not correlate with increased health risks when examined at a global level. This finding contrasts sharply with US-centric studies, which are likely influenced by so-called healthy user bias, a culturally specific phenomenon in which health-conscious Americans perceive red meat as unhealthy and therefore eat less of it. As a result, these studies report associations that tell us very little about the actual effects of red meat on health. In any case, very few people adhere to diets primarily based on animal source foods, with the exception of certain ancestral populations heavily reliant on hunting, herding, or fishing, or individuals following very low-carb or even carnivore diets, often as a means to address health issues like diabetes, gut disorders, or autoimmune diseases. More scientific data is needed to robustly evaluate the risks and benefits of such diets, but their therapeutic potential should not be overlooked. Potential concerns relate to the fact that such diets may risk suboptimal intake of fiber and of certain micronutrients and phytochemicals that are more readily sourced from plants. Furthermore, individuals prone to iron overload may need to manage their red meat intake or else consider bloodletting, while those with high saturated fat intake might experience negative effects on risk markers, particularly among high responders. A last part of the table that needs to be examined is the one corresponding with diets that are not only very high in animal source foods, but also contain substantial amounts of processed foods. Despite the scaremongering, there is no good reason to assume that moderate amounts of processed animal foods, including cheeses and processed meats or fish, pose a risk when incorporated into healthy diets that align with traditional practices. These foods have been fundamental components of regional diets and have served as important sources of protein and micronutrients throughout history. However, caution may indeed be warranted with heavily processed options. Harsh curing, smoking, or heating can lead to the formation of harmful chemicals, which may pose risks at excessive consumption levels. Therefore, sensible consumption is advised, treating these foods as tasty and nourishing dietary complements rather than as staple foods. This is where the Nourishment Table draws the line. The rest is up to you. There is a wide variety of traditional diets centered around cornerstone satiating foods that you can explore and adapt to your personal preferences and beliefs. Don't let anyone scare you away from nourishing food choices, whether they are animal-based, traditionally processed, or otherwise targeted by nutritional dogma. However, one crucial takeaway remains. Be mindful not to let your diet become dominated by ultra-processed foods, the hyper-palatable, prepackaged, nutrient-poor concoctions designed to be addictive and displace real food. These are the arch enemy of nourishment. Thank you for listening, and I wish you many enjoyable meals ahead.